Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Brussels Sprouts Live. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and we're going to welcome Jim Townsend.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Townsend. It's great to see you all.
And we're so glad you can join us. Today on Brussels Sprouts Live, we're actually in celebration mode. We are celebrating the release of our new report titled Understanding Russia's Calculus on Opportunistic Aggression in Europe. And the report examines how U.S. involvement in a crisis in the Indo-Pacific could shape Moscow's willingness to test NATO. Of course, there are several factors working to dissuade Russia from challenging NATO, but we show in the report that U.S. involvement in a major crisis in Asia would lead Washington to redeploy resources and would-be reinforcements for Europe to the Indo-Pacific, which would create meaningful gaps within NATO's defenses. And those gaps in turn could lead Moscow to perceive a golden opportunity to accomplish its aims, which we understand to be to divide Europe and the United States, to expand Russia's sphere of influence, and ultimately to revise the security order in Europe. Now, Jim and I have used this report as the perfect excuse to orchestrate a conversation with two amazing guests, two people who understand very deeply the dynamics we discuss in the report because they lived these issues in their previous roles. So we're very happy to be sitting down this week with General Philip Breedlove and Admiral Jamie Fogo. Phil, Jamie, welcome to Brussels Sprouts.
It's great to be here.
As always,
thanks very much for the invitation.
Yep, some brief intros. General Breedlove served as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and the U.S. European Command from 2013 to 2016, capping a 39-year Air Force career. And Admiral Fogo served as Commander of Allied Joint Force Command Naples and Commander U.S. Naval Forces Europe-Africa from 2017 to 2020, capping a 39-year Navy career. And before I get started, a quick note. So this is a special edition of Brussels Sprouts. So our live guests have the opportunity to ask their questions, which will, of course, be part of our Brussels Sprouts podcast. So if you have a question that you want to hear answered on Brussels Sprouts, please use the chat box at cnas.org/live or on X with the hashtag CNAS2025. Okay, so with all of that behind us, we're going to get to the report and its key findings. But as always, we like to set the stage for the discussion. And Jim and I were talking before we started this podcast about just how many things have changed even since we republished this report in the first week of September. You had the Axis of Upheaval Summit in China, where Xi and Putin and Kim put on full display their cooperation and intent to create an alternative to the US-led order. That, I would argue, was emboldening for Putin and I think contributed to or encouraged the Russian drone attack in Poland that we just saw. That was followed by the single Russian drone in Romania. We've had the Allies in response launch Eastern Sentry. We've had Zapad. So there's all of these things that we've seen transpire just in a short couple of weeks. And so just as our scene setter, and Phil, maybe we can start with you. How do you connect these dots? Do you connect these dots? What does the picture look like for you at the moment?
Well, I'll just say one more time, Andrea, Jim, thanks for having me on. And it's great to be here with a great friend of mine to appear. He can clean up all the mess I make this afternoon in talking. I don't do politics, but sometimes I'm critical of policies. And I think that we are currently in an age and a stage where our policies are emboldening our adversaries. I think Mr. Putin is very much emboldened right now. I think he came to the recent summit with our president with one message in mind: there will be no ceasefire. And despite the sort of stage setting by our senior politicians about what it would cost Russia if there wasn't a ceasefire. We came out of that meeting with no ceasefire and none of the follow-on actions that were promised. And so I truly believe that right now we are in a policy conundrum whereby the actions that we are taking, but more importantly, the actions we are not taking, are emboldening our enemies.
Jamie, what do you want to add?
Yeah, Andrea and Jim and Phil, it's great to be here with you today. And I couldn't agree more with my great friend and mentor, General Phil Breedlove, on the pressure that's being exerted on the United States. As the French would say, tous azimuts, 360 degrees around us. That parade in Beijing, hosted by President Xi, attended by President Putin, attended by Kim Jong-un, and members of the Iranian government and a host of others, and including Prime Minister Modi, raised my eyebrows anyway. It was an impressive display of military force and a display of solidarity between authoritarian rulers that obviously do not have the best interests of the United States or our allies in their wheelhouse. And so I remain concerned about that, because as this axis of authoritarianism works together, they can unfortunately help one another out to make themselves stronger. We've seen that in the skirting of sanctions. And you hear a lot about the bayonet analogy that comes from some of the great German, military philosophers and scholars, where you want to push the bayonet in, and if you feel mush, you continue to go until you strike steel. That's what Putin is doing. That's potentially what President Xi could do in a conflict over Taiwan in the future, which was the basis for your study. And unfortunately, the Russians have not hit steel outside of the Ukraine proper. Ukrainian armed forces have done a brilliant job in defending their nation. I mean, it is inspirational, in fact. I've watched what they've done in the Black Sea. We gapped the Black Sea from U.S. or NATO presence back in December of 2021, before this whole thing kicked off in the following months. And the Ukrainians have successfully, using drone warfare, driven the Russian Federal Navy out of Sevastopol to Novorossiysk and sunk about 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea assets. So that's impressive. We should be giving them a lot more top cover. And I'm afraid that any continued show of mush will lead to further pushing that bayonet. So it's time to stand up and strike back with steel.
Couldn't agree more with both of you. But the thing that you will hear quite often, and Jim and I hear this sometimes in connection with this report, but in other contexts, which is, well, the Russians don't really pose a dire threat to NATO. They can't even defeat the Ukrainians in Ukraine. And so again, just to throw that open, how do you agree, disagree? I think I obviously know what you're going to say, but how do you respond to those kinds of things? Because I will say, you sometimes hear it from this administration. I remember earlier this year, there were comments from various senior U.S. officials kind of making this straw man argument. Well, the Russians won't be walking across or going across Europe anytime soon. And so, how do we think about the Russian threat while they are being significantly degraded by the great Ukrainian efforts in Ukraine? But does that mean they're a lesser threat to NATO?
Well, I don't think you have to look very much farther than the news every night. Can you imagine 800 drones a night going into Warsaw? Can you imagine 800 drones a night going into any of the 3 Baltic capitals or Berlin? Just because, and I agree, the Russian military, the army part of their military has been significantly degraded. The fact of the matter is they are building this capability to reach out with other means whereby they can cause a lot of issues for NATO. And frankly, we in the West, including here in the United States of America, we are not ready to defend or handle that level of attack. And so it remains a sort of an asymmetric capability that right now Russia enjoys.
Yeah, I would add to that Russia, nobody knows exactly, maybe somebody knows in the intelligence community, deep and buried somewhere, how many casualties the Russians have incurred in this war in Ukraine. We see a lot of numbers out there. The speculation is killed in action, wounded in action could actually approach about 1 million personnel from the Russian armed forces. And those that are wounded, some of them just horrifically wounded, such that they won't be productive for the rest of their lives, and the state is going to have to take care of them. So we really don't know that. But in the meantime, Putin has consolidated his ability to mobilize and recruit, and there are another 1 million personnel under arms prepared to swarm on the Ukrainian problem, being augmented by Korean soldiers, North Korean soldiers coming into the battlefield, and they're experiencing significant losses as well. The Ukrainians have fought very bravely against them and have defeated them in the battlefield and sent them home in body bags as well. Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to care about that, and he just continues to provide cannon fodder for the Russians to use in Ukraine. So the bottom line is, if we do ever get to a ceasefire, if we do ever get to an agreement, whether that's a trade of territory in order for peace, and then there are security guarantees that are provided to Ukraine so that they can function and live in this new age, new world, new normal, then what does Putin do with these 1 million personnel that are ready to go fight someplace? You've seen him build up on the Finnish border. There's always been a consistency in threats to the Baltic nations that Phil and I know so well. And this most recent incursion into Polish airspace was another one of those bayonet tests. So what are they going to do? And flew a lot of drones in there and then watched what happened. And NATO air policing took down some of those drones, and some of them just crashed on their own. So that is disturbing. Is that a precursor to what might come after the resolution of this conflict? Or could this conflict in the near future, or the not too distant future, spill over into a Western European democracy that's a member of NATO, thereby triggering an Article 5?
Well, I agree completely with what you were just saying, Jamie, and I've got a question for you. But before I get to my question, I do want to give my own personal hello to you both for joining us. It's great to be in the trench with you guys, as we were back in the day, and I think our experiences from those days, it's critical now to take before the public, and I appreciate you all helping us do that with both the report that we're going to talk about, but also here today. And so, going back to the bayonet issue about striking steel, part of that that idea of making sure Putin knows that he's not dealing with mush. Particularly with this, to me, this escalation that this attack on Poland was, this escalation we're using the drones, and I was very fearful that, in fact, the most that they were going to find was going to be just some sharply worded statements by the section, and then crickets from the United States. I was so afraid that was going to be the only response, but instead we did get Eastern Sentry. SACEUR appeared along with the section, and they announced the program to try to supplement air defense all along the border, not just in Poland. And just, as you all are looking at that, and as I was looking at that, as with my DASD hat on, I think it's a great start. It's what we need to do. I'm glad we came up with more than just a statement. But anything else that you all will contribute based on our experience over the number of years with this gray zone conflict? It's going to be a tough and expensive program when it gets into its full extent. It's going to be high readiness all the time, and et cetera. What else would you all suggest be done in terms of making sure that Putin understands there's steel there? There's not just mush.
So I was going there anyway, but now you asked the question I want to answer.
I knew you were going to ask that. So,
so a lot of people continue to say that as long as Mr. Putin thinks he's winning, he's going to keep fighting. The 1.1 million and all the things that Jamie talked about, they're all real, but they don't matter because Mr. Putin thinks he's winning. And when he looks to the West, the rhetoric is winning for Russia. And when you listen to what we say in the West, it's not about who's going to win the war. It's about what will happen if we don't get a ceasefire. And I've been laughed at. I was laughed at roundly on X when I said that one of the most important things that can happen is Western leaders, to include our president, need to stand up loud, proud, publicly and say, Mr. Putin, you're not going to win this war. We will not allow it to happen. And we have fallen far short of that. Our policies are far short of saying you're not going to win. And I think that's one of those shortcomings I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Our policies are leaving us short in this discussion. So I would literally say it loud and proud on every venue I could to make sure the Russian people, the Russian oligarchs, the Russian leadership, all of them heard the West, to include the U.S. president, say, you will not win this conflict. And then take steps. I also got laughed at, but I'm a proponent of right now, today, all the seized money that we can round up around the world with other people holding it, take every penny of that seized money and spend it on weapons for Ukraine. Spend some in Europe, spend some in America, but build weapons for Ukraine. And then one more time, this is important, loud, proud, publicly, go to all the Russian people, all the oligarchs, and say, thank you for your investment in the defense of Ukraine, and let them sort that out in Russia.
Right. And I agree with Phil 100%. So, when you think about, what can we do to show more resolve and to show a barrier of steel? There are a number of things that could be done, but probably won't be done. Could you extend NATO air policing to the skies over Ukraine? Well, of course you could, but Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And air policing is a big resource drain for the alliance. Sustaining that over a long period of time would become quickly, I think, a political and a resource question, a budgetary question. Could the U.S. or her allies provide or sell more integrated air and missile defense to Ukrainian armed forces? Absolutely. Patriot batteries or THAAD systems, anything that's going to take down a ballistic missile, anything that would take down a cruise missile, or anything that would take down a drone would be welcome. I don't know if you all or your listenership saw Global Public Square with Fareed Zakaria yesterday, but President Zelensky was on for an exclusive interview. And he talked about what it's like to live in a country or to be in the capital in Kyiv and sustain 800 drones a night, which people speculate will be 1,000 drones a night by the end of this year. We know from their targeting that they're going after energy infrastructure, and it's about to get cold over there. So Ukrainians are going to have a very tough winter. Zelensky said in order to knock down one of those drones, he needed a munition that cost about $3,000 or 3,000 euros. It was on the show. And so if you multiply that by 800, drones a night, that's a significant set of resources that they may or may not have. When it comes to, the eventual end of the conflict or what's going on right now, exactly what Phil said. You talk about security guarantees. Do we put troops or allies in there Do we have a tripwire to deter the Russians from further attacks? Should there be a ceasefire, and should there be some kind of a peace agreement or some interim period of time where we work through the details of that? The most important security guarantee in Ukraine are the Ukrainians themselves and their incredible armed force, which needs more stuff. So the best thing we could do for security guarantees would be continue to arm the Ukrainian armed forces to the teeth, to demonstrate that steel and that capability that will blunt any Russian offensive. And, even as we've seen artillery shells go down, they're still very effective at attriting the enemy on the battlefield, whether that be North Korean soldiers or Russian soldiers. And the movement across this terrain, everybody talks about it. It's reminiscent of World War I. The lines don't move that much. And a lot of people get killed, which is President Trump's premise for this whole thing. How much longer can this go on? With casualties on both sides and destruction on both sides. So we need to get to an end game. I fully support him on that. And the best way to do that, if we're not going to put Western forces in there, is to make sure that the Ukrainians have everything they need and give them more capability and more long-range capability to go after some of these targets that are causing them harassment or pause. Going after drone factories. I think that's a very legitimate target, and the West could certainly do more to help them there.
Phil, did you have something to add before going to Jim?
Yeah, once again, I'm in violent agreement with Jamie. I would make one tiny enhancement to his suggestion. Air policing is a peacetime operation with peacetime rules of engagement. It would enhance the message of our presence if it was a defensive counter-air set of ROE. If we were to fly defensive caps that give you the ROE to take action should action be required. It's a subtle messaging difference, but what it says is our guys now can react to an ugly act rather than having to ask to react to a bad act, and then it could be over. So I would just add that one little enhancement to the suggestion that Jamie made. Otherwise, I'm tracking 1,000%.
Well, that's great to hear. I was exactly going to ask you all about the idea that's very similar. ROE would be part of this. There's ideas out there about a no-fly zone of some type, not over Ukraine, because like you said, Ukraine's not in NATO, but yes, over the Polish border, where you could stop the drones before they cross the border, but that also gives Ukraine a little bit of cover as well. The border isn't exactly like Finland's border with Russia, but it would be a start. It would set a precedent, and it would show a bit more steel. So what do you all think about something along those lines?
Opportunity lost. Back in 2013 and 14, Mr. Dasty, you might remember that the SACUR suggested that some of the options along the tree were putting defensive caps west of the Dnieper River and other things to show steel. And we chose not to do that because we said that will cause escalation on the Russian half. Well, we didn't do it. They escalated anyway, so we'll never know what would have happened had we taken the opportunity. We are at that point again. We are cap over Ukraine, west of the Dnieper River, and the old Lord of the Rings, thou shalt not pass. Okay, I'm serious. This is, we discard these things. And maybe life would be very different now back in the spring of 14 if we'd have taken some real action rather than admiring the problem, which is what we did.
I agree with you so much. That's going to be the title of my book, which will be an expose of how we got to where we did. Actually, Phil, I agree. And I remember those days so well, and those ideas coming out and all of us being shut down. So anyway, thank you for that. Jamie, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, Jim, thanks for the question. And, General Breedlove has flown in no-fly zones. I mean, he's like an ace F-16 pilot, and he has schooled me in a lot of things in the course of years. Famously, the Donald Cook incident up in the Black Sea, I showed him the picture of an Su-35 that came in at 500 knots, about 10 feet from the bridge of that ship. And he said to me, if that Russian pilot had sneezed, he might have stuck his wingtip into the bridge of Donald Cook and crashed, and then we'd be explaining why, we shot down this aircraft, which we didn't.
I remember that so well.
Yeah. Phil was the one that declassified that photo and got it out on the evening news same day, and that came, crushing down on Putin. It was such an embarrassment. He fired his fleet commander and 50 officers in the Baltic Sea. So it was, General Breedlove 50 and Putin 0 on that count.
Yeah.
But no-fly zone. So I established a no-fly zone in 2011 in Libya. At Joint Task Force Odyssey Dawn, I was the J3 for that with Harry Harris and Sam Lockwood. And we essentially a no-fly zone is a kinetic operation. You have to take out integrated air and missile defense, and then if there's somebody flying against you, you got to take them out. I think we knocked out 400 fixed-wing Libyan aircraft with the help of the United States Air Force and unmanned systems in the form of Tomahawks from U.S. Navy ships and submarines in the Mediterranean in a 24-hour period. It was so surprising that the combatant commander woke up the president, and he said, "What? No-fly zones established? Tell your people, great job." So they're not simple to do. Effectively, this past week, by flying air policing missions and actually firing kinetic rounds at these drones, it was the semblance of a no-fly zone, but not as well organized and not one in which, we were surprised. And so we reacted to that surprise, and we reacted well as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to eliminate the threat. Having a no-fly zone established over, any of the countries of NATO that have a contiguous border with the Russian Federation, where there might be further incursions of drones or something worse,
Right.
potentially a missile that maybe it goes astray. But I think that's a great idea, and it would certainly do what, Jim, you are asking for and what Phil has said, add a little steel to blunt this bayonet as it's pushing into Western Europe.
Yeah, so interesting. Thanks both for those responses. I want to pivot a little bit towards the report. We're talking about Russian opportunistic aggression. It's what we're showing. How do you put up steel so the Russians understand? And in this discussion, we've obviously rightfully talked about Ukraine because we all understand how the war in Ukraine matters, will shape the Russia that we get. We've talked a lot about the political will piece. And now I want to pivot a little bit to capabilities, because as what we talk about in the report is, any U.S. involvement in a major crisis in the Indo-Pacific could lead the United States to have to redeploy assets to the Indo-Pacific, and or the United States would not be able to reinforce Europe as planned. And those gaps in capabilities could create a window of opportunity that Putin, especially if the political will is lacking, would really welcome the opportunity to exploit. Those gaps could also emerge based on political decisions in Washington. And I do want to talk about that too, as the force posture is going on. But you both were in those hot seats, and this issue of simultaneity has, it's always been in the cards. What is it that you worry most about in terms of European defense, the capabilities that we would be lacking as an alliance in this kind of scenario? And we both talked with you extensively in doing this report, and so I'm almost asking you to cover ground that we've already covered in our own discussions. But yeah, just say a little bit about those gaps, General Breedlove, that you are most concerned about, and with the goal of really focusing attention of allies of where some of these extra investments need to go.
So thanks. And I'm going to tread a little bit dangerously on some of Jamie's territory here, and he will correct my paper very quickly. as I sort of said to the team when they were looking at this, what worries me the most are the sort of high-end enablers. We used to describe them as high demand, low density, LDHDs, low demand or high demand, low density objects. And there are a lot of things that we bring to NATO that the alliance is not deep, and in some cases has no capability in those sort of high demand sort of things, the really exquisite intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The ability to do suppression of enemy air defenses is a big one. When you can't suppress enemy air defenses and establish air superiority, you get this large static World War I kind of war you see in Ukraine. When you can suppress enemy air defenses and you can establish air superiority, you see Operation Rising Lion, where in less than 3 days, air superiority over an enemy nation is established. And now you have the exquisite ability to disassemble that military at your leisure because you own the skies. And so there are a few things that we have provided uniquely for the alliance in these exquisite capabilities. The alliance is making strides now. They're making investments in Aegis kits for their ships. They're buying into the kind of Western technology that can go do suppression of enemy air defenses. They're just not deep enough. And the loss of those high-end capabilities is what worries me the most. The good news is that our air forces and our naval forces are uniquely not static. We love our Army, but it takes a while to move them. But the capabilities of the Navy and the Air Force dedicated to Europe can rapidly respond if they have to, or rapidly re-respond if they have to. And that makes a big difference. And Jamie can clean up my mess now.
Hey, thank you, sir. Yeah, before I go to the maritime, I'll have a lot to say about that. You know, some of the shortfalls. Every theater has a problem with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR. So, you know, we have these flying machines and we have things in space that give us the big picture of what's going on in any particular geographic area or multiple geographic areas every day. We have exquisite intelligence, but there's just never enough orbits of these platforms to do what you need to do to satisfy our curiosity and our needs so that we can plan and we can deter and we can blunt the enemy's offenses. So that's number one. And that, you know, that goes for space, satellites, P-8s, you know, MQ-9, Triton, all that stuff. Secondly, strategic lift. And this is where I make my head nod to the United States Air Force. We talked about Joint Task Force Odyssey Dawn. I mean, I was absolutely amazed. Major General Maggie Woodward was 17th Air Force at the time. General Welch was USAFE. And we had this plan that we put out for establishment of the no-fly zone. They went to battle stations, and before you knew it, there were about 140, you know, KC, what are they, 46s, Phil?
KC-135s at that time.
135 tankers flying in Europe in refueling stations all over the place, from Mildenhall down to the Gulf of Sintra. NATO had about a half a dozen of them, and the United States Air Force brought in something like 134. It was absolutely amazing. There is no other nation on earth that can do that. And they were pushing the first night of the campaign. You know, I know I was up most of the night, 2.2 million pounds of fuel. And it got up to a crescendo of about 3.3. I remember these numbers, they stuck in my head. And so nobody else can do that. So if there's a need or a threat someplace else, then those enablers, those orbits, and those refuelers are going to have to go to another theater. And that may leave certain areas, I won't say gap, but I'll say potentially under-resourced. Now let's talk about the maritime. Phil is absolutely right. He's speaking my language here. So the beauty of a Navy, and particularly our Navy, which is predominantly forward deployed. So we have about 300 ships. We'd like to have 600. We're working on it. But about 100 of those ships, since I can remember, since data was coming out from the early 2000s, we've had 100 ships underway pretty much every day for over 25 years. Since 9/11, and those ships experience wear and tear, but they're out there. They're forward deployed. That was the beauty of Mahan's strategy for control of the sea lines of communication, for forward presence, for protecting our commerce, et cetera, and our interests and those of our allies. They're out there. You can, and this is a term that Admiral Scott Swift and I use a lot, but it kind of dates us because it's fallen out of favor. You can swing assets from one theater to another. And with a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Ford, state-of-the-art, 100,000 tons, carrying all these strike fighters, it's fast. It is super fast. You can get from one theater to another in less than 2 weeks. And so we can respond. What's the first thing the president says when he wakes up in the morning? Clinton said this, right? Where are the carriers if there's a crisis in the world? We have deployed no less than about 7 carrier strike groups to the Middle East or to the Eastern Mediterranean since Israel was attacked on October 7th. And so I don't think that we're going to gap or leave theaters uncovered. And so I want to leave a bit of a sense of reassurance with allies and partners because we have that ability to swing. And certainly the United States is not going, and particularly this administration is not going to leave Israel in a lurch when it's at a critical time. Now, there are assets out there that are high demand and low density. There's 50 or so attack submarines. Everybody wants them. We've got a number of them in maintenance, and we're behind, and we need to get them out. Every combatant commander wants well more than he's apportioned or allocated. And when the balloon goes up in one theater, there's going to be a demand signal, an RFP for these assets that goes to the Secretary of Defense, and he's going to have to decide because the Secretary decides what goes where. And those ships will swing in the theater. There's 5 destroyers in Rota, Spain. It was one of the best things we ever did to forward deploy those destroyers. It takes like 10 to make 4. So you'd have to deploy 10 destroyers on a transitional presence instead of 4 permanently deployed or 4 deployed naval forces in theater. And I fought really hard to get 2 more, and we got 1 in the last administration. They do great work. They're at sea all the time. They're doing integrated air and missile defense. They have helped with some of the, certainly with the strikes from the Houthis in the Red Sea and also the strikes against Israel. Sea lift, delivering the beans and the bullets and the fuel to the troops. Very important with what's going on in the Red Sea. It'll be very important for what's potentially going to happen in the Western Pacific. And we don't have enough of it. So a lot of that, you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. But I want to make sure folks understand we're not leaving anything uncovered.
Well, that's really reassuring there, Jamie, particularly the carrier swing. And as I hear you, and I certainly understand what you're saying, and I agree, and I wonder how the situation would be 3 weeks into a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and casualties, of course, in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe we lose a carrier or important members of a task group, Aegis, and suddenly they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, i.e., they're robbing Europe to pay Paul. And those Aegis out of Rota get sent over there, whatever. So that is something I worry about. But I think you're right in terms of the Navy, particularly being able to swing. But as I think about this with a NATO hat on, at the summit in The Hague, the summiteers agreed to force goals for all the allies to meet in order to fill out that family of plans that NATO agreed to. General Cavioli and that whole crew for a number of years now had put together this exquisite segment of plans, regional plans, but to make those things go, allies have to provide the wherewithal. And so at that summit, they all agreed to the shopping list, and they all agreed to put money towards that shopping list, the 5%. And so this is something that actually for a defense planner, it crossed some T's and dotted some I's. The plans and the money and the shopping list all came together. But my fear is that all came together before the global posture review. And so the plans that they put together were based on the U.S. forces as they are today, because no one knows what the force posture review is going to say for Europe. And I, having had to deal with one of those, and General Breedlove, I know you did too, they change all the time as suddenly bosses begin to look at it and say, well, maybe it's too much. We got to take some risk there. So my fear is that when that report is released, that Europe is going to have to do a review. They're going to have to get their pencils out and start scrubbing the numbers, because it could be large. We don't know. We don't know if it's just going to be the Biden reinforcement, the rotational forces that Biden put in there after 2022. We don't know if it's going to be something out of Rota. We don't know much at all. And so my fear is that what they agreed to at the Hague a couple of months ago isn't going to have a long shelf life if, in fact, this posture review takes a big cut into Europe. And I hear differing things. Some people have told me it's going to take my breath away, and some have said, well, maybe not. And so I don't know. But I was wondering how you all thought about that, having been in a seat where you would have to prepare for something like that coming out of the U.S.
Jim, a couple of things I would say. One is, and this is meant to be a joke, but it's not a joke. Mr. Putin gets a vote.
Yep.
Right now, Mr. Putin's vote is going to help, I think, Europe quite a bit, because it could not be more clear. Mr. Putin is giving our president the what for on all of his efforts in Europe. And so at some point, the OSD has got to come alongside the president and say, we're got to put some steel, as Jamie pointed out, by what's going on in Europe. And so I'm sure that commission is working and chugging away, and we can only hope that they're paying attention to what's going on in the real world, as Mr. Putin, I think, has demonstrated clearly that he never was a partner in peace for Ukraine. He is not now a partner for peace in Ukraine, and he will not be in the future in any way, shape, or form a partner for peace in Ukraine. And so we have a theater level war going on in Europe right now. And at some point, our policies are going to have to reflect that.
And well, one thing that gives me a little nervousness about the policy is that we've already a couple of days ago announced that we're going to cut the Baltic, assistance program for the three Balts. And so to me, that was the wrong signal to send after those drones. But Jamie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think to your point, Jim, if there's a kinetic fight, and if Americans get involved in a kinetic fight in the Western Pacific, and you use the example of the sinking of an American aircraft carrier, it's like the movie, one of my favorite movies about submarines, Das Boot, where Jürgen Prochnow, the CO, screams, "Alarm!" and everybody runs to the bow of the ship as they use everybody's weight, human beings' weight, to get the bow down and drive the boat to a safe depth so they can avoid an attack from the air. So we are going to respond to that. And there will be theaters that will have to send some of the forward deployed naval forces or transitory naval forces from that theater. And CENTCOM could be a bill payer. EUCOM could certainly be a bill payer. So I don't want to leave people with the impression that we are not going to go, because if we have to, we will go. The caveat there is that Europe is this country's a melting pot. We all came from somewhere, and there are a lot of people who came from Europe, and there are a lot of Americans in Europe, and a lot of business interests in Europe, and we have embassies and consulates all over the place. We're not going to leave those folks in a lurch anywhere in the world. We are always going to defend our interests. And you kind of alluded to this. I mean, you talked about it. What's lacking right now is clear guidance. And we're not that far into this administration. And I think they're working on a national security strategy. We've heard about it. It's been hinted at. And from that, there will be a national defense strategy. There's a lot of discussion about, hey, what's going on down in South America and Venezuela and all that stuff. Well, you notice that's part of my theme earlier is that, the president and his cabinet has determined that the war on drugs is going to take a higher priority. So we're focusing assets on that. And we've swung some assets from the East Coast of the United States to go down there and take care of business. And so that's something that's important to the administration and important to their base, and they're doing something about it. But we don't have that comprehensive overarching strategy. It's coming. And I think there are some hints out there. Dr. Bridge Colby, brilliant guy, somebody I know from my work at CEPA, and I would say he's a friend. Got an autographed copy of his book, Strategy of Denial. All you have to do is read it to determine how he would react when faced with confrontation out of the Western Pacific. And he talks in his book about differentiated credibility. There is going to have to be some bills that will be paid by other theaters to support the campaign against the pacing threat, and that is the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, so I want to weave in a couple of questions. We've got a few from our listeners. We've got one question from Zongo who asks, what specific measures can NATO allies take to ensure rapid and effective collective response in case of sudden Russian aggression, especially if the US military has diverted resources to other global priorities? And so I think this gets at a lot of what we're talking about in the paper. I mean, a lot of these, the high density, high demand, low density assets are a thing. And so we need allies to, as they're fulfilling regional plans, as they're increasing defense spending, I think also to be investing in some of the capabilities that would be most in demand if the United States were invested. So Phil, how do you think about that? Especially NATO allies, what should they be doing to try to, because I think the key is to ensure that Putin never tries, right? I think we all agree. We've seen the horrific atrocities that happen in Ukraine. And so our goal has to be taking steps now to ensure Putin never tests the alliance or kicks off a conflict to begin with. And so what do you think allies need to be doing at this juncture?
So you may not like my answer, and frankly, there are those who don't. But I go back to 2014 and what happened when the first invasion of the Crimea, and then the invasion of Lugansk, Donetsk, and the Donbass region occurred. There were cries. Some of the nations, a small group the first time, a bigger group the second time, came to my office and were like, Mr. Sakier, what are you going to do? And we took options to the NAC, and the NAC chose in both cases to take no action because they were afraid it would accelerate the problem, escalate the response. And so what did we do? The Sakier couldn't take any action because the NAC forbade it. The U.S. European Command commander went to his two bosses and got approval to take U.S. unilateral action and put cap over the three Baltic nations flying out of European assets, didn't even have to deploy from America. Now, that's not self-aggrandizing here, but what happened was when America took action, within less than 2 days, several other big nations joined us. And then the NAC was embarrassed enough to say, holy moly, we got to get involved. And boom, they became aboard. And so why do I bring this up? Mr. Putin has successfully peeled off a couple of our nations now. I think he believes he can control the NAC's reaction to any provocations because he's got a couple of guys in his pocket. And so I think that NATO needs to understand that their future may be first reacting in a coalition of the willing and then following with other nations as it comes along. It might not be a clean Article 5 response, but the fact of the matter is we cannot allow Mr. Putin to control NATO decisions because he's got a couple of leaders in his pocket. We need to be prepared to step out and get action going and bring the NAC along as it is capable.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, I would agree. And in response to Zonger's question, so that's really being politically ready to respond. And that's extremely important when it comes to the alliances. The alliance will not move without a mandate from the North Atlantic Council, which is represented by ambassadors from all the states of NATO. As far as the tactical, or what are we going to do to respond to Russian aggression on the ground or in the air? You know, we talk a lot about, and this is really in Phil's domain, we talk a lot about defensive counter air to protect our troops. Well, the Russians do the same thing, and they have very effective integrated air defense systems. And I hesitate to say as a naval officer that, you know, he or she who controls the airspace controls the battlefield. So you've got to be able to attrit if the Russians were to cross a line into a NATO country. They're going to have capabilities with them that allow the free movement of their troops and the maneuver of their troops. And to a certain extent, it's not actually that way in Ukraine, because we're talking about a non-NATO country, and Russia can only go up to a certain part of the border. But if you can take out those enemy integrated air defenses, then they can't cover their troops, and you can attack the troops, and you can push them back. And you know, with Putin, he's a very calculating individual. So the risk calculus has to be that he's got greater, you know, as we say in the submarine force, you've got greater than 50% chance of success in an undersea engagement. Take it. If it's less than, consider the options. So if he's relatively assured that it can be successful, he will move. If he's assured that it's not in his best interest, or that he will be unsuccessful, then he's not going to take that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get one more question, and then hopefully Jim and I will have time for one last question. I've got a question from Brian, who asks, do you see a plausible scenario in which Russia uses reflexive control and nuclear threats together to seize territory as a fait accompli? And I'll note, this is one of the risks we highlight in the paper, that if the US is engaged in the Indo-Pacific, that the lack of those capabilities has the potential to, or at least will convince Putin that NATO will be slow to respond, and he therefore will look to seize territory, use nuclear threats, and dare NATO to respond. I mean, is that how you see it, Phil? You tie in in this kind of scenario, what are you expecting from Putin?
It's the Narva grab.
So I actually am a contrarian here. I think they have already done that. I think across the last 11 years that we in the West have been absolutely deterred. This whole idea of reflexive control, I think, is the most successful campaign Mr. Putin has waged. He has 4 times since 2008 amassed his army, marched across internationally recognized borders, invaded his neighbors, and attempted to subjugate them. Georgia, Crimea, Donbass, and now 3.5 years ago, a whole shebang. And every time, the way that he controls the West, if you watched, we actually had our students looking at this for a while, studying what was coming out. Between 7 and 10 days, every 7 to 10 days, somebody at the top of the food chain in Russia talked about tactical nuclear weapons. Oh, we're changing our policy. We're buying this new weapon. We're moving these weapons forward. All the time, a competitive, just a completely predictable cycle of poking the West in the eye that if you try to oppose us, really, we're going to nuke you. And it has worked. The Biden administration was absolutely deterred, and this administration is absolutely deterred. And we've got to figure out how to get out from under that. 2 presidents in our past have done that. President Reagan and President Kennedy have figured out how to get out from under that. that reflexive control, deterrence, threats of nuclear weapons. We have to figure out how to do it today.
Anything you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, I agree with Phil. I mean, Putin's been doing this for quite a while. I remember Phil was sat here during Baltops 15 and 16 because we were standing on the battlefield in Poland when the ships came ashore. And Putin was so incensed by, a 50-ship, 5,000 naval personnel presence of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization operating north of Kaliningrad. His response was, well, I'm buying more nuclear weapons, so he's an escalate to de-escalate kind of guy.
Right.
Did this in Ukraine. Oh, I'm gonna mobilize my forces that support the use of tactical nukes. I'm gonna put these forces at a higher readiness level. And folks in the West get nervous, rightly so. But did he do anything with that? No, I think he's a master poker player. He's bluffing. And I think we could have done a much better job in the last administration of pushing back against his bluff, calling his bluff, and responding to his bluff with force and steel. And before I go, because I know you guys are going to wrap up, the one thing I wanted to say was that Andrea, you and Jim and CNAS have done a marvelous job on this report. I would recommend to all of your listeners that you read it. It takes into account what is the contingency if the United States gets involved in something. You chose to look at a blockade in Taiwan. Forces are going to have to flow. There's going to be a tip fit, a time phase force development doctrine, flow of forces out to the Pacific if bad things happen, and particularly if American ships are attacked. And so how's that going to look in the rest of the theaters? The one thing that this administration has done for Europe is made them aware that they're going to have to do more, stand up. So we went from 2% to 5%. It's really 3.5%, and then 1.5% for infrastructure, right? But all sorts of stuff is happening. People are actually taking Ben Hodges seriously and looking at the gauges of railways so that they can match them up so that we can get Abrams tanks to where they need to be or somebody else's tanks. And there's a lot of ships being built. Norwegians are getting new frigates, a lot of money being spent on submarines and all that, and land forces and air forces, and all that is goodness when it comes to the defense of Europe. So if anything came out of this, painful period of honesty with one another, like, hey guys, we're going to have to go focus on the pacing threat in the Western Pacific. It is a higher level of readiness for a bad situation should it arise, and I hope it doesn't in the European theater. And your report highlights that beautifully. So well done, BZ to CNAS for that.
Well, I think you just closed the podcast, and we didn't even pay you to do it. I mean, that was it. Yeah, no better endorsement than coming from you, Jamie, and you, Phil. But I think we always struggle to end our conversations on an optimistic note, and so anytime we've got this kind of glimmer of optimism at the end, I think we're going to take it where we get it. And thank both of you for joining us and for all of your support throughout this report writing process. Obviously, your experience and your insight is invaluable. And we thank you. And I think listeners and all of the consumers of that report, thank you. So yeah, just so glad that you are willing to do this. And I hope we have another opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, with that, we'll close this out. And thanks everyone for joining us for Brussels Sprouts Live, and tune in next week.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.